Welcome to Brandon Hall Group's Excellence at Work podcast. You will hear from industry leaders covering innovative, cutting-edge business, learning, and HR topics that weave current market research and technology into each episode. Our Excellence at Work podcast is hosted by Brandon Hall Group's Chief Operating Officer and Principal HCM Analyst, Rachel Cook.
Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Brandon Hall Group's Excellence at Work podcast. Don't forget to subscribe. Today we're going to be talking about an upcoming webinar that we are conducting with Asha Pandey, the founder and chief learning strategist from EI Design, and David Wentworth, our principal learning analyst from Brandon Hall Group. Welcome and hi to both of you.
Hi, Rachel. Pleasure to be back.
Yep. Thanks for having me back on.
It's great to have you both back. And Asha, you are a reoccurring guest on our podcast. So we always have a great conversation and interesting topics to cover. And today in particular, we're going to be talking about prove and improve how to measure and demonstrate the ROI of your training programs, which is actually a topic of a webinar that we have scheduled coming up on July 28th. It's scheduled at 11 a.m. Eastern. And we have an ebook also supporting that topic that's going to be available in our blog from our episode today. So for those of you that are listening in and joining us today, please take a look at these upcoming two events that we have in publications. So, but let's get started on our discussion today. And so what we are sharing with all of you is a little bit about what to expect in more detail on the webinar. So, and to begin, there's so much training and there's so much learning going on and content being developed. But what's really important is also how do you measure and how do you maximize the ROI of e-learning or learning, and all that goes into the development of learning and the access of learning, and then the engagement. So why does measurement matter, and why aren't completion rates and smell sheets enough? Asha, can you kick us off here with your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. Sure. I think, Rachel, it starts with the basic premise that if something can be measured, it can be improved, right? And going a little deeper, the fact is that the training investment is intended to get us something going, right? Whether it's from the learner side or specifically from a business gain that was sought. Now, unless the alignment of the training to the eventual goal is also established, which is again a part of the metrics that is necessary for assessing the impact of the training, you're not going to get to see this real value. On a slightly different level, it also has an impact on the budgeting, right? So constantly getting more budgets now are contingent on what did you show as a demonstrable value from the previous year's investments. And so that's becoming very important. Now, in the absence of any measurement, what tends to happen is that the budgets get allocated. It is not really getting metered on the effectiveness of a given program, right? So, if you had the metrics, you could have even decided that some programs are just not delivering. They need to be either rejigged or maybe dropped. And what are able to do justice to the mandate should be getting further investment and should get ramped up. Now, outside of all of this, I think there's another important reason, as we've seen in the last 2+ years, how L&D's role has become far more strategic and significant, right? Now, their ability to show this value, I think, goes a long way in ensuring that they continue to be in the spotlight. So, all of these reasons are clearly leading to the fact that today, more than ever, I think the need to measure and demonstrate the value of your trainings is very, very important now. You can go up to the ROI or otherwise. To the point of the smileys and that part, Rachel, it is a start point, right? Because you are judging the learner reaction, but it shouldn't end there because you're still not connecting the dots to take the training to learning, learning to performance, performance to the business impact, right? So it starts from there, but there's a lot more to it.
Yes, indeed. And David, you see a lot of that in our research, don't you?
Yeah, it's what an interesting thing to me was one of the questions we asked in one of the studies around measurement was, or actually it was a general learning study around what are the challenges that are preventing your learning from being as efficient and as effective as it could be. And the number one thing was there's just not enough time, which I think that's probably the answer to almost anything when you ask about a challenge. But number two and number three were the inability to measure learning's impact on individual performance and the inability to measure learning's impact on organizational performance. And I think it's important that those arise as so high as challenges to learning. It shows that the measurement is not some sort of endpoint, some sort of outcome of learning, but it actually is an integral part of how well we do with learning. If you're not able to measure those impacts, then you can't change course, you can't fix things, you can't do a better job of targeting. So the inability to measure actually it greatly impedes your ability to do a good job of creating and delivering the learning in the first place. And I think around the idea of why does it matter, why is it important? We do find that organizations wonder to themselves how important is this measurement because they are sticking only to things like completion rates and smile sheets, which, as Asha pointed out, those are not bad things to measure, very important data, but by themselves don't tell you very much. And so there's not a lot of value in there, not a lot of insight. And so when that's all that organizations have from a measurement standpoint, they say, well, I don't really see why measurement's so important because it doesn't tell us anything. You need to get a little deeper and into those measuring the impacts and outcomes to really, have any sort of impact on learning.
And I'm surprised based on where we are in our maturity of learning that companies still struggle with this. I mean, I am surprised, and I'm not surprised. I don't want to underestimate the magnitude of good measurement
Yeah, yeah.
approach.
Yeah. In fact, when we have these conversations with our customers, it is deemed as the holy grail. I mean, do you really have that answer? Right. So some of the reasons we see is that I think the exercise begins with not quite establishing a link between the training to, as I said, all the way to learning, the performance, and then the business impact. Now, the measurement process cannot be done post facto. It needs to be an integral part of when you're conceptualizing the training, right? The need has been identified, and then you're getting into how it's going to be measured, right? The other bit that we are constantly see as the answers, besides the time bit that David already mentioned, is that which framework or model would work. Now, a lot of the organizations find that while they're familiar with the models, not everything can be applied in the same manner across different programs and across different organizations. The needs vary again, right? So the big question is that which model, which framework, which methodology would work. Now, at different levels, a lot of data points are getting generated, right? But the ability to sift through them, make some sense out of them, and then put them into actionable insights. So organizations who've invested in some sorts of frameworks or methodologies often have this challenge of being able to do justice to the data points that are coming in, right? Now, outside of this, what tends to happen is that some of them may be able to sort the data, but then what further action till you hit the bullseye, right? So actionable insights tends to be yet another factor. A lot of times, the capability or sometimes even capacity of the in-house team can impede this whole exercise, right? But if I were to sort of pinpoint to one bit, is that I think that holistic view of what is learning and then finally building it all the way up to the impact, I think that missing link probably is the biggest factor. Others can be still addressed.
You hit an important point there, Asha, with the capabilities. I think that's a data scientist skill set is not something that's typically readily available to most learning teams. Some organizations are lucky that they either have um, you know data analytics skills available to them through the organization, sort of cross-functional, if they are large enough. But it's not typically a skill set that's readily available, and so organizations have to do a better job of matching the an, analysis that they can and are willing and able to do with the skills they have and the tools that are available, making sure because there are a lot new tools. Tools have just continually gotten better over time from an
Absolutely.
analytics standpoint that allow someone that maybe doesn't have a full data scientist background to be able to answer questions and get insights through an analysis tool without having to know all the ins and outs of these actual, the ANOVAs and regressions and the types of analysis that run. And so being able to match the tools you have with the skill set is going to go a long way. I think that's like as you pointed out, that's a big hold up from organizations. And I think also companies just get overwhelmed with the amount of data that they have. They don't know what's important, what they can use, what they can't. Does it all align?
Absolutely.
I mean, few organizations have a really strong data strategy where every single part of the
Yeah.
business can confidently say our data is accurate and it lines up with what this other part of the business has. So it's a bigger picture than just learning. If you want to start to measure how learning is impacting all these various parts of the business, um, data needs to be speaking the same language across the business.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And speaking of data and metrics, what do you believe is, or what do you believe that organizations should be using as far as what kind of metrics?
Yeah, so the way we look at it, Rachel, is that there's what the very basic one, which we at the Design call it as the L&D metrics. So this is where we are talking about the registrations to completions, and a lot of times there's definitely the end of program assessment scores, which are although targeting primarily the knowledge acquisition bit, but these are in place, right? So this basic metrics, which may have also the learner reaction and building all the way to registration completion and the assessment scores, is one spectrum of metrics which is fairly easily done, and most organizations have this in place, right? Earlier, we used to have the terminology called business metrics as the second metrics, which we've, in the last year and a half, bifurcated further. So we have then the second suite, which is where the learner performance gain metrics. Now, after the knowledge was acquired, what happened next, right? Did it get applied in the context that it was supposed to be? Did that application trigger the desired improvement, or did it fix the necessary gap? Now, this is a precursor to the eventual KPI that it is supposed to impact, which is what the business view is, right? So besides these three kinds of metrics, another important perspective, I think, which I would like to highlight, and it is something that we'll cover in our webinar as well, is the ROI versus now the return on expectations, right? So we are seeing a very conscious shift from a pure monetization and then a determination of value to return on expectations, right? And of course, we are covering it in much more detail in the webinar. But I think that is important, and that helps you truly leverage the metrics to what it is intended to do, right? Prove and improve.
Yeah, yeah, and I think companies need to really get into that mindset that Ash is discussing because the whole idea is what's the point of the learning program? Why does this learning program exist? It can't possibly exist simply because we want people to finish it. That can't be the ultimate outcome of a program. There has to be some bigger thing that we're after. So starting to dig into that, why do these things exist? Why did the business request this training intervention? What are the things that they want? And being able to have that conversation and be able to translate these business needs into learning outcomes or objectives is really what's going to help define what those metrics are. There are obviously a lot of universal standardized metrics like completions, hours of training, all of those things. But you could use those, but when you start to get into more meaningful measurement, there is no necessarily universal list because the needs of every organization are different. The needs of every part of the business of within that organization are different. Each program is trying to address something differently. So the idea is to stop and think about why do these programs exist? Why did we create them? That's where you start. Like, okay, how does the business know that we need improvement in this area? What are they seeing that's letting them know that we need improvement? That's where you can start to build your metrics. Those things that have set off that red flag that says we need to improve this, those should be the metrics we're after, and that's what we need to be measuring.
That's a good point to segue into my next question here is what goes into a proper training needs analysis in order to get you that information or that insight?
Yeah, so I think that again we've made a few specific changes to the way we do the training need analysis, and we've introduced actually a step before this. And again, I'm going to be talking about this in more detail in our webinar. Is that you've decided you want to measure the impact, right? But before we even get down to the TNA, we've introduced a step which we call as reorient and reimagine, right? So reorient itself, there is a small toolkit that we leverage, which starts with the definition of learning itself, right? So does it end with acquisition or does it need to go further, right? And the fact that yes, there is a clear business need, and yes, there is even clarity on from the business side on how they would like to see the impact. But what about the learner,
Hmm.
right? So integrating the learner's preferences, expectations, and asks has a direct correlation to training effectiveness, right? But often that gets missed out. So amongst the many things that we are doing is that the TNA starts with the learner need analysis. So we've sort of, I used to earlier use this as a Venn diagram, TNA versus LNA. Now I think we've flipped it to say that the core is the LNA, and then you're building the TNA, and then you go down to the training formats and then the strategies. And then we have the ways and means through which reaction to all the way to impact gets measured, right? So the TNA phase in itself is much deeper, wider, and at this stage is when we talked about the metrics identification. So, also deliberation with the business to truly understand the need came from a challenge. And the challenge was impeding them in accomplish certain goals, right? Or so why did it happen? And what is the touch and feel that they would like to see? So the other element that we've integrated into the TNA is also the ROE, the return on expectations, which is giving us far more definitive answers, and the demonstrable value can be accomplished far more efficiently too.
Hmm.
Interesting. Yeah, and we've spoken about the training needs analysis in previous conversations, and you know, I remember one of the questions I had for you a while back was, how often do you have to do a training needs analysis since it is quite in depth, and you had a good answer to that. Do you want to comment on that again?
Yeah, so the way we've done, I think my answer was also evolved slightly because as we are doing more and more engagements. So, as I said, the focus of TNA itself is wider, which is one of the things that we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing is that implicit in this measurement exercise is the fact that nothing should be done post facto, right? And if you're focusing on the learner, making sure that maybe between the prototype and the pre-alpha stage, we should open it out to a focus group who's eventually going to be consuming it, right? And this can feed back into your TNA because the view can be dramatically different,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we've seen contrasts. We get from the business unit a clear need for the training,
Right.
and when we discuss the same thing through focus interviews with the learners before we get down to even strategy quantification, their view is very different. No, actually this is not what would help. What would truly help is if we had something like this.
Right. And before we wrap up today, there's a lot of different measurement models out there.
Right.
Hmm.
Some, that many companies are very familiar with. One or two that they can kind of explore, or they have already done so. What do you recommend, or what measurement models do you find that the companies should be doing?
Rachel, my take is that strength of a given model is only how relevant it is in your organization, in your context, both from application and your ability to very easily leverage it across different programs. Right. So for instance, one of the Brandon Hall research insights that I was looking at showed that about 63% of the people are using the Kirkpatrick model, which we know is the most popular. But what was interesting in that study was that 44% are using very custom in house programs, right? So I think we'll cover this even in the webinar is that I like to demystify, right? You have various models and nobody's stopping you from picking up what you believe is relevant from a combination of models as well, right? But bottom line is finally what we're going to do with this, right? Clarity on that answer, that what you want to measure, why you want to measure, how you want to show that required value. I think the focus should be on this journey,
Mm-hmm.
right? So for instance, our framework, which we call as litmus, which truly tests the assumption versus the eventual gain, we've drawn cues from the Kirkpatrick model, but we have adapted. We've given it the latitude so that it can be customized for a given requirement, right?
Mhm.
And that, I believe, should be the way we should look at it.
Yeah.
I don't believe rigidity is really, really important here.
No, and I think you actually get at one of the biggest issues with that. Obviously Kirkpatrick is the most familiar model, and like you cited the research that shows a majority of organizations use it, but we also see that most of them only use it up to level 2, right? They only really reference it to level 2. So if you're not really fully leveraging the model, is that the right model for you? And why are you not able to do levels 3s, levels 4 if that's the model you're using? So that gets into Asha's point of maybe instead of thinking that I have to rigidly adhere to this particular model and then not be able to use it to its fullest, then figure out how do I adapt this model with maybe some others and some internal thinking into something that does make sense and allows me to move forward and to make that change. We find this all the time whenever there's any sort of framework or model that's out there. They're very helpful, but because everyone's so busy and they're trying to get to the answer, they tend to want to rely on these frameworks to be, this is sort of written in stone. And if I just do these 4 things, this will take care of it. It really requires a little bit of thought and insight to say, how do I best leverage these frameworks? And as Asha's just pointed out, and happens with her clients all the time, you start to think about that, you end up with this sort of new model that's based specifically on your needs. And so in almost every case, to some degree, companies that are having success, the model they're using is somewhat customized because they've been able to take it and inform how do I use it for my needs. And that's really where you start to see some success.
Yeah.
And for those that are not really getting to the real need of what the learning is supposed to accomplish, then you really need to kind of reassess why is that the case, and why aren't you optimizing it, and how can you do a better job, because then you can create better learning experiences based on the insights of whether it's impactful or not impactful. So that's really important, I think. And both of you, Asha, thank you so much for sharing your insights here, and for David as well. And we are going to have a lot more to go into on your webinar coming up again on July 28th. So
Yes.
those of you that are interested in measurement and analytics and how best to optimize it and how best to measure your training and your ROI of your training programs, please join us on July 28th, again at 11 a.m. Eastern. And we will also have an ebook coming out here for you to have access to. So both the webinar and the ebook will provide you a lot of great information and help you either validate what you are doing or help provide you some additional thoughts and perspectives on how to better maximize your training and the ROI of your training programs.
Yeah, Richard, if I may just add the last bit.
Sure.
I think the combination of the webinar and the ebook is sort of a demystification of the complexity associated with this whole exercise. And I've made it very real, very practical, very easy to apply, and easy to customize. And I think that's where the answer lies.
Absolutely.
Prove and improve. I love that line.
Yes. Just when you think you've proved it, you need to prove it again. Well, thank you. Have a wonderful day. Thank you, David. Thank you, Asha. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks,
Thanks,
David.
Rachel. Thank you very much, Asha.
Bye.